Okay, well, we want to welcome everybody to the first quarter environmental meeting. Our guest speaker is Mr. Risotto. He's a native New Yorker from Long Island with a BS in biology from Cornell and an MS in marine biology from LSU. He currently lives in Alexandria and has 2 adult children. Currently he's the senior director for the American Chemistry Council based in Washington, D.C. He is the lead staff for both federal and state policy, including PFOAs, PFOSs, and the other legacy Pfas chemical substances, which is what our topic is about today. Steve has been engaged in the ACC's effort to consider framework for the assessment of chemical alternatives. And prior to joining the ACC, Steve was the executive director for the Halogenated Solvents Industry Alliance. And Steve, with that, we want to thank you for putting on this presentation for us, and you have the floor. And thanks everybody else for joining us this morning.
All right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for spending some part of the afternoon with me. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to go through a few slides just to set the stage. Because of the video format, I'll stop at a couple of points just to see if there are any questions, and so you don't have to wait till the end. Go ahead, Vicki, if you go to the next slide, and then actually you can go to the slide after that as well. So just while Vicky's doing that, I don't see the change yet. There we are. That's the one I need. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Talk a little bit about what are PFAS. Let me go ahead and just do this. A wide universe of substances with different physical, chemical, environmental, and biological properties. And first, let me step back. The terminology per and polyfluoralkayl substances. Per meaning that they are fully fluorinated, while poly meaning that only partially fluorinated, but have at least one carbon atom that is fully fluorinated. So that's sort of the distinction. Back in 2018, the OECD, the Organization of Economic and Cooperative Development, identified about 4,700 individual PFAS
Steve, can you
substances.
Hear me?
Yes.
I think you may have to speak up a little bit more.
Oh, okay. Apologies. Let me get this a little closer to my face. So, 4,700 individual substances. Is that better, Chris?
Yeah, I can hear it okay. Is everybody else okay with it?
No, loud and clear for me.
Okay.
All right. So
we think we do need to go to slide 3, though, please, Vicki.
awesome. Okay. Thank you, Vicki, and I'll try and give you the signal to change slides. OECD identified about 4,700 individual substances, individual PFAS in 2018. There have been, a variety. You may have heard other numbers, and at this point, there's an attempt to try and get a little more consistency in terms of the definition. But of those, EPA has indicated there are about 600 that are in active commerce. So, you hear a lot of discussions about thousands of PFAS being used. It's really not the case. It's only about 600 that EPA identifies are being sort of used commercially. And I think, as probably most people on the phones know, these are very useful chemicals used in a wide variety of applications. one of the key parts or key aspects is the carbon-fluorine bond is very strong and, provides, resilience and strength, et cetera. And while that's very much a plus on the manufacturing side, it does mean that these products have very long environmental lifetimes, which is, one of the issues that we are facing. In part because of that strong bond, they're very resistant to grease, oil, water, and heat. And as I said, have found their way into a wide variety of applications. Go ahead, Vicki, if you go to the next slide. But one of the key things that we are stressing is the difference in the chemical properties for these substances. And you'll see that that while they're all sort of been defined as having one fully fluorinated carbon, we have there are gases, liquids, and solids. Some very lots of stability and mobility to some with very less. So ranges of toxicities and also ranges of sizes. One of the things we'll talk about are floral polymers, which are very large chemicals and not likely to get into the body or to be dissolved in water. So they quite a variety of applications. And Vicki, if you go to the next slide, by way of example, if we look at hydrocarbons, you've got, solids like a plastic like polyethylene, you've got a liquid, something like, alcohol, and then a gas, propane. And no one would ever suggest that those three types of materials are the same, have the same properties, or should be considered or regulated the same. If we go to the next slide, Vicki, the same is very true with the PFAS, where we not only have gases in the form of refrigerants, but we also have solids like a fluoropolymer like PTFE or Teflon, and then fluoropolymer alcohols that are used in a wide variety of applications. Now, if you shift, Vicki, to that next slide, slide 7. Sorry, I'll give the slide number. Yes, go on to slide 7. So this is, not, there won't be a test at the end, but just a general sort of breakdown of the types of products. You've got, non-polymers and polymers. And then within the non-polymers, you've per perfluoro, where they're fully fluorinated, polyfluoro, who are only partially fluorinated. And then in the fluoropolymers, you have a variety of products. So quite a broad range of substances. Let's go ahead and move to slide 8, Vicki. Among these, one of the fluorotelomers you'll hear about, and just an example of the wide variety of uses for these products. One of the key ones is that the Class B fluorinated firefighting foams. These appear to be the reason for the broad or the incidences of groundwater and drinking water contamination because of the use of these products, not so much in fighting fires at airports and military bases, but more so in the training and testing of the equipment. But that, we're seeing a lot of reports, particularly around airports, military bases, of incidents of contamination with the firefighting foams. If Vicki, onto slide 9, the fluoropolymers, another large class of chemicals. These are things like Teflon, and again are used in a wide variety of applications. And let's go ahead, if you go to slide 9, and then there we are. And then, that one's good. And so this, again, to sort of emphasize the point of the variety of uses, we're seeing that, not only in commercial products, but they go into automotives, into electronics, oil and gas, healthcare. A lot of the materials, the PPE used in the COVID, in addressing the COVID pandemic, are coated with PFAS so that they are resistant to any spray, any liquid that would get on the material. So they're very important in a whole variety of applications, and which is what I guess makes them, have the profile they have of it these days. So let's go on to slide 11. Now let me talk about, and that's sort of the use side. Why, why are they in the news? And have been, seems, for quite a while now. Go ahead to slide 12, Vicki. The first part of it, and this is really what kind of, I guess, created the level of the interest concern among the manufacturers, is the longer chain PFAS, things like PFOS and PFOA, have a tendency to accumulate in the body, and some of these chemicals have biological half-lives on the orders of years. As a result of sort of reports, or I guess studies showing accumulation of PFOS in workers, at plants, the companies phased out that material, and then subsequently also phased out PFOA, which was showing the same tendency to accumulate in the body. As a result of that, and not surprisingly, you've seen a dramatic drop in the levels of PFOS and PFOA in the blood in the U.S. population. In the case of PFOS, it's been an 85% reduction, PFOA 60% reduction. If you look at the shorter chain PFAS, things like PFBS, which is 4 carbon, PFHPA, which is 7 carbon, there are very little detections, either none or a small percentage. So the shorter chains ones don't accumulate in the body, and in fact was one of the reasons why the manufacturers have shifted from the longer chain to the short chain in terms of production. Tell you what, let me stop there and see if there are any questions from the group. I don't see any in chat at this point, but I'll go ahead. But please feel free to kind of throw a question in chat if you like, or feel free to interrupt me. My wife does it all the time. Let's move on to slide 13. Now, you've also undoubtedly heard about, the detections of particularly PFOA and PFOS in groundwater, in drinking water, in various places around the country. EPA did a national survey in 2013 to 2015, looking at, this is all large and medium-sized public water utilities, as well as a representative sample of small utilities. They looked at 6 PFAS, but the most notable ones, PFOA and PFOS. And even among these chemicals that we are reading a fair amount about these days, you can see that the incidence in drinking water is really very sort of localized, very regional in nature. Now, one of the criticisms of the EPA analysis was that the detection limits were relatively high, at least compared to current technology. It was 40 parts per trillion, that's trillion with a T, for PFOS, 20 parts per trillion for PFOA. We're now in the single part per trillion range in terms of our ability to detect. But even so, given the tox information, it doesn't look like, and this was EPA's original sense, that there really was a national issue to address here. It was more localized. Now, if we go to the slide 14, to bring it home a little bit more, in Indiana, very few sites with detections, and I grabbed this from Environmental Working Group site, who is they are compiling reports of contamination around the country. This is sort of what the picture looks like in Indiana. The purple are military bases, DoD-related bases, and we see half of 5 or 6 of those in the state. Otherwise, really not detections. I think there's a site just below Chicago where there was an initial report of a detection of one of the substances, but it turns out that was a sampling error, and actually it wasn't detected. So really in the state, the issues are around, and you may know this better than I, issues are around the defense facilities where we've seen some contamination. On to slide 15. This is, we're now seeing a number of states that are doing some drinking water sampling. Michigan was the first and probably the most comprehensive. They sampled every public source, drinking water source, not only communities, schools, tribes, childcare, in the state back in 2018. They looked for 14 PFAS, which was the number that was detected at the analytical method that was available at the time, and the detection levels were down in the single part per trillion range, so not the same. You can't issue the same criticism of what Michigan did, and it was more than 90% with no detections. Like 7% with a detection of any, above 10, a few between 10 and 70, and then 2 above the EPA health advisory number of 70 parts per trillion for PFOS and PFOA. And those 2 had already been identified and were already being addressed. So, comprehensive survey in the state of Michigan, no widespread problem in terms of incidents, even detections of these materials in the drinking water. Now, I think I saw a question about the number of sites that were sampled. Again, it's typically in the EPA database, it was all large and medium-sized public drinking water sources. I think that came out to maybe, between 4,000 and 5,000. And then, another several hundred smaller sources. In the case of Michigan, it was all public drinking water sources in the state. So, reasonably comprehensive. I think you can, they're not, they are, I think, indicative of the overall results in both cases. Now, let me move on. Let me stop there, see if there are any questions on either the blood sampling or the drinking water sampling that's been, that I've talked about. We'll just say that other states are following Michigan's footsteps and doing either statewide sampling or more focused sampling, and we're seeing very similar results. In large part, we're identifying the problems the areas that we already knew about, and confirming that broadly there is not there are very few detections in drinking water sources. Move on to the next slide, slide 16. Now, there is a fair amount of criticism, particularly of the previous administration, that EPA was not doing anything at the national level. And as you probably know, that has prompted a number of states to take action. But just to kind of, I guess, correct the record a little bit, in early 2019, EPA issued kind of a first ever action plan for a group of chemicals for PFAS. And in that action plan, they laid out a number of things that they were planning to do. And this is a list of some of the things that the major things that they've already done. As of today, as of this morning, actually, they have officially announced that they are going to develop national drinking water standards for PFOA and PFOS. About a year and a half ago, they established interim recommendations for cleanup levels for PFOA and PFOS in groundwater, setting it at the 70 part per trillion, which was their drinking water health advisory, with a screening level of 40 parts per trillion. They also, imposed some new restrictions on the import of long chain PFAS, of PFAS that had already been phased out of manufacture in the U.S., but could still be coming in from imports, including the inclusion of these products in articles, which are sort of a new extension of EPA's authority. So trying to shut the door on any of these legacy products, any more of these legacy products coming into the country. Expanded test methods for other PFAS. I indicated that Michigan sampled for 14. EPA validated methods now have they're up to 29. Sorry, was there a question? Okay, very good. So no, the EPA is working on tox values for a number of PFAS. In addition to looking at if there are ways to sort of subgroup PFAS, based on chemical properties, et cetera, so that they're not looking at each of the individual 600 chemicals, but can start to say, these chemicals look alike, they behave alike, and we may be able to address that group of PFAS, consistently. And then also, as I said, looking at, what's in commerce, what's being currently used. And as I indicated, there are about 600 PFAS that are on the active commercial list. Let's move on to slide 17. Beyond that, it's not just EPA that is working on this issue. DOD has been very engaged, has done a lot of research, and as part of the National Defense Authorization Act for 2020, which was passed in late 2019, Congress imposed a number of provisions, one of which was to require reporting under the toxic release inventory process for 172 PFAS. Some of you may be dealing with that now. The reporting is was for year 2020, and we'll start to see those results in July of this year. They imposed restrictions on the use of that firefighting foam, the AFFF, at military facilities. Sort of tried to hold DOD's feet to the fire in terms of, working with states where there is contamination. Requiring additional information from the PFAS manufacturers, and also putting more money in the state revolving fund so that states had additional funding to help address, drinking water contamination issues. Go on to slide 18, and just so you know, my last slide. But again, there has been criticism that EPA isn't moving fast enough, isn't doing enough. So we have seen activity in a number of states, and this I call your attention to the ECOS website. That's the Environmental Council of States, ecos.org. They have been very engaged in PFAS and have a number of really good informational pieces. Their research arm, ITRC, has been doing a fair amount of work on PFAS remediation. So they're a great source for information. They have just updated their ECOS has just updated their PFAS report, and as a result of that, there are 6 states that have established drinking water standards for one or more of the PFAS. 10 states have groundwater standards, 3 states surface water, 8 states soil, and a new trend, 3 states that have air standards. And I think you're probably not surprised that Indiana is not among any of the states that have set up standards. In addition, an additional, a fairly large number of states that have advisory guidance, advisory levels for, for presence of PFAS, primarily PFOA and PFOS, in the various media that that the states use in sort of identifying, prioritizing any sites. Go ahead, Vicki, to slide 19. And this is just my contact information. And, I encourage you to please reach out, send me an email, give me a call if you have any questions on anything I said or anything else related to PFAS. But let me stop and see, what questions you have.
Steve, this is Nate Hahn with Evansville Regional Airport. And so obviously when you mentioned the airports taking a kind of getting the public attention for this, we've noticed in our industry and taken some precautions to protect from some of that. But why is it, do you think that the aviation industry is being, I don't want to say singled out necessarily, but why has that gotten the attention when, as you mentioned, it's in a lot of other industries and it's kind of widely used? Even if you go back in the day, some of that was even used, my understanding, for farming applications and that sort of stuff. It seems like was more widely used off airport than on.
Yeah, Nate, a good question. One of the approaches states are taking is, okay, if to try and focus their efforts rather than, like Michigan, sample everywhere and with a hit or miss approach. They say, okay, where do we expect to see it? And California is a perfect example. They have identified certain industries or certain facilities, and they started with landfills and airports. And for the reason that they know that at least some airports are doing testing, training, etc. with the foams, and landfills are you're going to get the disposal of the materials you're talking about, then leaching into groundwater, and then potentially contaminating wells. So it's sort of resulted at from answering the question, where do we expect to find it? And you guys were doing it because FAA said, this is the stuff to use because it put out the fires, it saved lives, etc. But as in many things in life, it's sort of doing the right thing comes back to haunt you. Nate, does that answer?
It does, and yeah, thank you. It seems like, low hanging fruit, and governmental bodies were the kind of the first ones that got people's attention. Again, like you said, airports and dumps and such.
Yeah.
And we've been trying to be at least somewhat proactive, and actually there's now systems for our airport rescue firefighting equipment that actually cycles it and keeps it all internal. And so we now are able to do that sort of stuff to help protect.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, and we, in Indiana and a few other states, we actually sponsored a legislation for on the use of the firefighting foams containing PFAS, so that it wasn't being used for training and was only being used for testing, if you were taking the appropriate precautions, but still preserving the ability to use it in a real incident, in a life-threatening incident. And that's, I think, passed in half a dozen or more states. And I think it has hopefully, reduced some of the pressure to go further than that, and still allowed you the option to use the materials with PFAS.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Steve, are PFAS required to be on product labels?
No. Now we may be moving in that direction, but no, not from any regulatory, from an FDA or CPSC standpoint.
So how are we supposed to determine whether or not we have products which may contaminate our water?
Very good question. You're starting to see some products who say they don't contain it. So, and those are usually correct, although, there have been incidences of false advertising. It's really challenging because, I was amazed to find out that my favorite dental floss has PFAS, is coated with PFAS. To some degree, some of these products, if it's a floral polymer, like a Teflon, you're not going to see the breakdown and the contamination that you would from a liquid material. So, it depends a little bit on what type of PFAS and the form it's in. But things that are grease resistant, a lot of food packaging, and currently that is being phased out over time. And I think FDA is basically set a sunset date. It is challenging to know where I mean, I guess you kind of look at, what are the properties of the material, if they would lend themselves to inclusion of PFAS, probably worth investigating, going upstream and kind of seeing if the manufacturers are using it. In some cases, we're finding it even when folks say they're not using it. And so it's kind of like, okay, how is it getting there? Because the nature of these products is they have been used so widely and still are being used widely. Yeah, sorry, that was not a very reassuring answer. I know, Barry, but sort of the nature of the beast.
Maybe I should put the question this way. If you're processing Teflon with temperature and physical properties, I mean, does that provide more of an opportunity for PFAS to be created? You made the comment about liquid versus Teflon, solid.
Yeah, now Teflon, typically, a brace, if you think about a pan, a Teflon coated pan, you may flake off pieces of the coating, but it's not going to melt. The reason it's so useful is the heat resistance. So you're not going to melt it and get absorbed into the food, but it could conceivably flake off. But when it flakes off, it's like, we used to have a colleague who said it's like swallowing a Lego. It just goes through your body. Your body is not going to break the Lego down. It's just going to pass it through, and you're not going to see the accumulation in the body. So you wouldn't with a floral polymer, you wouldn't see the breakdown. It'll happen over many years, but you wouldn't see it in an operation per se where you're applying heat. Please, other questions. I'm trying to give the best answer I can. Hopefully the answers are helpful. They're sometimes depressing.
Chris, it looks like you're on mute.
Thanks. I've got a customer that has a Teflon, a product that's got some Teflon in it. I guess it's considered in the group, and they're trying to get recommendations from the manufacturer about disposal practices, and currently that manufacturer is telling them that they're not going to give any advice at this time, one way or the other.
Right.
What do they do?
A really good question. Our folks are, and we have a group that is, looking specifically at the floral polymers. They're looking at, destruction techniques, thermal destruction techniques. If you burn these in a standard municipal waste incinerator, will you destroy it? They indicate, there isn't a lot of data, but indications are that yes. A municipal waste incinerator operating, under standard practices is going to destroy a Teflon. Beyond that, disposal in we've argued, disposal in a permitted landfill that has a leachate collection system is an appropriate disposal for a material, for PFAS, because it's not going to be getting into the environment. So there are ways to dispose of it because I'm guessing because of the questions, concerns, and the litigious nature of our society. There is some concern about providing advice that could come back and haunt them, but there's really no reason why you couldn't dispose of these materials the same way you dispose of other materials, even those that you consider that, certainly from a hazard material point of view, but these products are not hazardous, not considered hazardous at this point, at least by regulatory standards. So putting them in a permitted landfill isn't a perfectly acceptable disposal method, although some landfills have started to refuse it, as I know. So now, question about CAS numbers. The 4,700 that I mentioned that OEC identified, those are the number of PFAS with individual CAS numbers. So this again is a very broad range of materials, each with many of which with CAS numbers, some of which do not have CAS numbers.
Okay, I've got
Other
another
questions?
I've got another question, then I'll try to be quiet. But okay, so here we are, we're in Indiana. Let's say we're a manufacturer, and we know that this freight train's kind of coming at us from from the state level, probably because it's already, as you mentioned, it's already on its way in Michigan and Illinois and some of these other states. Does your group have like some talking points for us to discuss with our local and state legislators that could help us with a better set of regulations versus just ending up with whatever we get?
Sure, and I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Marcus Branstad, who is our rep in the Midwest, who does a lot of this stuff. Marcus, why don't you go ahead and you know better than I specifically what you've done in Indiana and other states, and what we could do or what we have.
And my apologies, as I didn't know I'd be called on today. I got caught, Zoom triple tasking. So the question was, what has kind of been done legislatively in Indiana? Am I on there?
Mark, it was more about what materials do we have to help in discussions with local legislators, et cetera. And I wanted to kind of kick it over to you because you've had those discussions, and maybe have a better sense of what's best received, what works well, et cetera.
Sure. So last year we supported a bill that would ban the use of aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF, that contains intentionally added PFAS. That was passed in the legislature, I believe, unanimously, and signed by the governor. So that is currently state law. That bill actually went over quite well with legislators. And maybe to her dismay, if anybody knows Representative Peggy Mayfield, she's kind of become now the point person for PFAS in the legislature, and so I have to continuously apologize to her for that, as she did carry that bill and had a load of education. What we communicated with that bill, that if you think about a fire department, or if you think about the number of Class B fires that are fought in the state of Indiana, it is very, very few. These are the high intensity liquid fires, not very many. So when we're talking about contamination or release of this material, the majority of it, like Steve had said, happens during training and testing. So as alternatives are being developed and things like that, this gives us time to the stock that is out there to be used for emergency firefighting practices or prevention measures. The way this stuff works is it's actually quite incredible. You can actually use it to prevent a fire from igniting because of the blanket nature that it does, and it can actually suppress fumes as well. But that was a proactive piece of legislation that's been passed in multiple states around the country that just kind of immediately takes care of the majority of any kind of release to the environment. You're talking probably in the 90% percentage, of the amount of foams that were being released were simply being done by people that are training and testing with their equipment. Beyond that, there has not been any legislation that has passed in Indiana. There were a few bills that were introduced this year. None made it past the committee deadline, and and I don't believe any received a hearing. Indiana is kind of traditional. They look to the federal government to lead on these issues. They look to the EPA. They see the EPA. And Steve and myself and our counterparts at ACC had a pretty lengthy discussion, much like the presentation that we gave here today with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. And so, even through that conversation, we've kind of understood that, they truly are looking to the federal government. And that's kind of what we are, that we are proponents of as well, that the EPA should be leading on this. And the patchwork of different, if you're talking about a drinking water MCL or something like that, you can look at every state around that has passed one of these things, and not a single one of their numbers are the same. And so that should also go to show you that the states might not be the best to determine what is the best number, in these instances. And so, I think that Indiana has been actually taking a pretty thoughtful approach. They've passed legislation that is proactive and pro environment and also pro firefighter. So I guess I hope that kind of answers your question on what we've done. I know Peggy may feel, like I said, she's kind of the leader when it comes to PFAS issues in the legislature right now. But generally the issues have not seemed to gain a lot of traction.
Good. Thanks, Marcus. And so, Chris, I'll just say that, we have developed sort of talking points on a lot of these issues, we have on the firefighting foam issue for sure, on the MCL issue, because it's emerging in a number of places, on, food packaging, as these things emerge, and now more recent on, per your previous question, on disposal and destruction. What we find is, it's better to be for something, right, as opposed to just saying, no, don't do anything. So, we've tried to be, proactive when appropriate, or at least responsive, and say, yeah, we understand the concern, but, if you're looking at MCLs, focus where the problem is, or where the consensus is, PFOA and PFOS, and, hold off on looking at any of the other PFAS until we understand the nature of those chemistries better. In the case of, food packaging, it's, FDA has basically set a timetable, just use that timetable as appropriate, and don't get out ahead of that. So we've tried to, develop the talking points, focusing on the importance of the products, on the diversity of the products, and then, to offer something that is constructive in the discussion. That's served us pretty well, certainly in Indiana, not so well, maybe in Wisconsin. But at least people listen, and you've got a seat at the table.
I guess if I could just add one thing, and I don't know how much we've touched on it, and I think Steve has done a great job of kind of laying out the 4,700 plus different chemistries that reside within the class of PFAS. And this is what we spend the majority of our time on with legislators, is if you try to ban or regulate PFAS as a class, the unintended consequences are astronomical. And when I can say that because we wouldn't be able to launch a spacecraft into space. We wouldn't be able to land the rover on Mars. We wouldn't be able to fly on our next vacation. We wouldn't be able to have solar panels, to help us meet our climate goals and our greenhouse gas emissions reductions. All these things would become impossible if we were to regulate this chemistry or ban this chemistry as a class. And just simply put, trying to educate folks that there are certain chemistries that have toxicological values, have bioaccumulability, and there are certain chemistries that do not have those properties, all within the same class. So I guess if I wanted your chamber to walk away with one thing from today, was just a brief knowledge on the difference between the class itself and the individual chemistries that are out there, including the legacy ones that are generally the most have the most issues, but also the ones that are no longer produced or used in the United States.
Thank you.
Yeah, any other questions, please? And I didn't see the question, but I will, you know, Vicky, please feel free to circulate the slides to the group, you know, and that may be helpful as, you know, in talking points, et cetera, and discussions with folks, and certainly kind of reach out to us if there's more that you think we can help with.
I have another question. Okay, let's say that we're getting ready to dispose of some material, and so we're doing the, you know, the profile sheet for the landfill.
Mhm.
And the question is, does this material contain any PFAS?
Right.
So that's such, you know, as you've spoken of, that's such this wide range of everything. Is there a way, I mean, how do we, is there a better way to handle that than just say, you know, well, yeah, it's one of the 4,600 or.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say the you know, if you can provide a bit more specificity in terms of which are the PFAS, that might be helpful. In a lot of cases, you're not gonna, you know, you may not have that data. You know, as Marcus indicated, the legacy PFAS, the PFOA, the PFOS, the ones that are generating, that we know the most about, that are generating the most debate, you know, they are no longer in production. It's generally the short chains where, you know, they don't accumulate in the body. You know, for those that we have tox information, they seem to have, you know, less harmful effects in the health and environment, a better environmental profile. I think the more you can provide that sort of information, that should help. You know, again, I mean, some landfills I think are just saying no to any, and you'll only get so far, right?
But I mean, there's no way you're talking about if you're talking about a garbage truck, you know, it could be in any food package, but again, that could be PFHXA. You know, it could be an FDA approved chemistry for food contact. And when the FDA gives those types of approvals, they're assuming you're eating the package. So if you go and get a Taco Bell taco, they don't think that you're even taking the time to unwrap it before you eat it. And because they assume 100% transmission from the chemistry to the food, even though that doesn't happen. But you know, if you're talking about just taking a load to the landfill and them asking you, does this contain any PFAS from the entire chemistry? I don't think that you could really get away with any load. If it contains household wiring, if it contained an old cell phone, you know, the amount of this material that's out there is you know, it's everywhere. But it just depends on which chemistry you're talking about. If you're disposing a load of antiquated firefighting foam, then I would say yes, I may have legacy PFAS on board here. But I mean, that's kind of the nature, as Steve said, this is the nature of the beast. This stuff is so widely used because it is so effective in what it does.
Well, I think the situation that I was talking about, I don't think the landfill knew what we were talking about. And it was just a very general yes, no question. You know, we didn't have much of a choice, actually.
Well, and now that you know, now that you know more, it becomes harder to say no. And they don't know. It's probably a standard question that they were told to put on their intake form. And it's a pretty difficult question to answer correctly.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, it reminds me, and one thing that I forgot to mention is all of the the PFAS that are currently on the market have been subject to review by EPA under their new chemicals program. This is not, these are not chemicals that were grandfathered in before TSCA was passed, and that are, that we know nothing about.
We lost your
Whether
audio.
that
Oh, never mind. Go ahead. We lost your audio.
how robust that process was, but they have all gone through review at EPA, FDA, wherever that with that particular application and who monitors it. All right. I think, have we exhausted your questions and you in the process?
I just wanted to let everybody know that, so this has been recorded and we plan to put this up on the Chamber's website under the advocacy area. So if you have colleagues who weren't able to participate, or you know of another customer or something who might be interested in learning about it, we'll have that there for people to direct to and get their own self-directed education.
Awesome.
And Sally, Matt Norris represents us in Indianapolis, and I know he couldn't make it today, but if you have any concern or anything, that you can feel free to talk to him as well.
Right. I work with Matt a lot. And so we were not completely able to connect on this, but I think, again, we'll let the legislators know that this is out there and they can watch it on their time too if they are interested in learning more. So
Awesome. Very good. Well, thank you all. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present. Really appreciate your attention, your questions. Hopefully we answered at least some of them.
Thank you. You guys did a great job.
All right. And
Appreciate
let's
it, Chris.
stay in touch.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.